Okay. So, the Performersion is a format that had been devised by Alexandra Wolf, Program Director of the Republica and the Performing Arts Program, for whom I am here speaking today. And its goal is to let experts from the fields of performing arts, digital arts and technology development onto a level playing field and research field, and enable real collaborations. And that worked out. In 2016 we started. This year we have a funding break or a dip. And from 2019 and 2020 until 2021, we're happy to announce that we got EU funding for that format. So you will find us at Republica next year and the year after that and the year after that, and also in other European cities. My dear co-panelists enter the stage while I'll try to level the field of this talk as well. Please come onto stage. So the main reason for that panel was that discussing the same problem a year ago with Carl Ginett, we figured out that all the haptic mechanical developments to enable full physical feedback in VR are probably not the ones we will use in like 10 years. So the major things, you might all know about them. I just repeat them very quickly. It's either mechanical or electronic based feedback on the skin, like the Teslasuit or some data gloves. Somebody had tried it. It's some work with heat and cold as well. They give you an immediate feedback. And then there's also the dream of a Neurolace network, but that is still a dream, bought by Elon Musk, and it will be inserted in your brain and use the brain as a direct interface. And then another one where Carl and me differ. Carl thinks that the Ultrahaptics, it's a startup that works with ultrasound, that is crossing over ultrasound lines, waves in the space, so that you get a physical feedback through sound waves, that this might be a good consideration, but you still have to have a very big array of ultrasound speakers that engage. And all these technologies are and will be complicated to wear. And so our thesis was that there will be other ways of learning feedback in VR more and more developing. And I'm very happy that there are 3 people on stage that know more about touching and the different forms of touching than me. And I'm glad to introduce Ramona Mosse. She's a lecturer for theater and performance art at the Freie Universität. Gerko Egert, a theater and dance scholar, also at Freie Universität, and an author of the major new book on touching in dance. And Melanie Jame Wolf, she is a world-renowned performance artist, and she left people stunned by her performances, and they have significant and never felt would be the right word, never felt scales of touch within them. And so I'm very glad that you 3 are here. And my first question would be, what are your thoughts towards this panel's title, To Touch in a Virtual Space? Ramona, would you like to start?
Okay, sure. So thank you very much for having me. I'm really glad to be here. It's a very exciting setting and format for me, coming from the sort of more traditional theatre stage. And I mean, basically the reason, I guess, why I'm here and what I've been working on is a performance that was a performance where we were trying to figure out what to do with the body in VR. And it was called Playing with virtual realities, and it had dancers that were engaged in VR and partially in VR and partially not. And so really what there became like the big kind of stickling point, and what we were trying to figure out was how to kind of how to have the body reappear in the virtual space for the dancers, because the biggest problem for dancers who work everything through their kind of somatic experience was to be in VR and have this very intense experience, but not to be able to see their bodies anymore. So what I've done is I've brought you a little clip, actually, and maybe I'll show that to you, and then gives you a little bit of a sense maybe of what we were doing. And also my contention is, I think, that we'll have to get around of trying to find a technical problem, a technical way of figuring out touch in VR, but that really what we can do is figure out sort of perceptual tricks and methods of synesthesia to kind of combine our different senses and create a kind of sense of wonder, I guess, that is there in the theatre anyway, but that this kind of thing of switching your perception and really kind of messing with it is something that happens in VR and also happens in theatre, and that sort of is parallel. And if you want me to, I'll show it to you now, or I'll show it later. Then we'll have it done and over with, and then I don't have to get up again. All right, so this was my parallel between theatre and virtual reality is like this oh my god experience in both of them, right? And what we were doing was to kind of create this kind of playing field with these two dancers, and the important thing was that they were supposed to negotiate between being in VR and outside of VR. So how could they touch, how could they communicate, how could they be with each other while one of them had this intense visual experience and the other one didn't. And I'll show you a little 1-minute clip from that.
Welcome. How about dancing? Danger, dee. Start dancing.
All right. So what we did in this, so we had always one person that was in VR, and what they were seeing was projected behind them on the screen, and so that the audience, and there was a normal live audience, was watching them, was not immersed, but was kind of like watching their immersion, I guess, in a way. And what was happening on the screen, we were using very sort of basic VR applications that exist, like the Google Tilt Brush. That actually happened in Google Tilt Brush, and so the idea was that the dancer would somehow be able to connect and touch the other sphere of the VR by sort of tracing their movement. So their movement became visually available in VR while they were moving live outside in the actual space. And so that between those two, between this visual sort of like trace and the sort of actual bodily movement, there would be that sort of way of communicating and of touching each other in a way, in a sort of more abstract way. And the other thing that we were doing, that we were trying to create a common sort of soundscape. And this is, I think, where I'm kind of trying to go with this idea that maybe touch is something that happens through like a multiplication of senses, and that what happens is that when you hear something and when you're touched by sound waves, that in many ways maybe you can fake the actual touch, the haptic touch, and that maybe there are ways of sort of getting around this this moment of having a body in VR. So I'll leave it here for the moment, and then maybe later on I'll have something else. But that's to start you off.
Gerko, how is that reflected in your book or in your in your statement? Is touch just skin touching skin?
Yeah, thanks for this introduction and for these remarks on virtual reality. So in my work, I have nothing to do with VR. So I think my task is really to come from the side of thinking about touch in in dance and performance. And so when I worked on touch, I was really interested in like these multiple layers of touch, or these multiple dimensions of touch that are active in every touch we perform or that occurs to us. So we always have a dimension of affect, of like a very being affected by touch. Then we also have a sensorial dimension, and which is closely connected to the affective one. And one that I was really interested in was the dimension of movement. So for me, I think it's really important to think about touch not as the moment of bodily contact, of just the moment when two bodies are in direct contact, but to think about touch as a movement that is consists of approaching somebody else and as well as withdrawing from the other body. And when we think about touch as a movement, for me, a lot of questions that are related to touch change in very fundamental ways. So the whole dimension of the affectivity of touch, of to differentiate between, let's say, a blow and caressing somebody is really a question of movement, of how fast we approach somebody, how slow we do it, we all know the situation of shaking somebody else's hand and like just to shake it a bit longer makes a normal handshake really creepy. And so it's these kind of rhythm and movement I was interested when I was thinking about touch in dance and performance. So in virtual reality, I don't know. I think of course a lot of questions come up again, and especially in relation to think about, when we think about touch not only as the bodily contact, of course we also have the touch without touch, and I think this is really the question that gets intensified, or that becomes relevant when we think about touch in virtual reality, where we maybe don't have the moment of two bodies touching each other directly, but all these moments, let's say, where touch is in the moment of appearing or disappearing. So that would be interesting for me to talk about the touch as a movement and the non-touch, let's say, in it.
Melanie, does that reflect from your perspective as an active artist who's getting very much in touch with audience from performance to performance?
Hi everyone, and thank you, Julian, for the invitation to be here. For me, I'm very interested, of course, in VR. I became very interested in VR recently when I had my first VR experience at Museum der Bildende Kunst in Leipzig. There was a work by an artist called, I hope I get her name right, Natalie Ruggiero. And it was a short experience, an immersive experience, where you basically are in a teenage girl's bedroom and you start trashing it. You'd be able to pick things up and smash things. And that, of course, was a very seductive experience, and it was fun. But up until that point, I hadn't been interested in working with VR. After that point, I was very interested. But I think for me, the big question is a question of... yes, touch can be a choreography or a score, or it can be understood as affect. We understand that touch is not purely about a physical, material point of contact, but it's also something that operates within the virtual or the immaterial spaces. But it's also qualitative. Touch is qualitative. If we're talking about touch operating between two human agents, which is generally what we're talking about, I think, there's the question of intention. And that intention informs the affect of the touch. Your touch is qualitative, and I think that's something that's interesting for me. I mean, I don't know what the techniques are of that, and I'm not interested in them. But I think for the purposes of the conversation, it's these ideas of is the quality of touch, and is that qualitative difference perceivable then by an audience if we're talking about VR in a theatrical or a performance or an art context, because then it needs to be representation of something, or representational of itself in a way.
How does an audience feel or understands your intention in a touch? Or how do you try to touch or move so that the audience can understand your intention?
Theatre magic. No, I'm joking. Well, I think something that's very interesting to me in my work, I make work generally that can be considered feminist work. I make work that is about the representation of women. And I'm very interested in work that is typically considered the labour of women. And there are many different forms of work in which affective labour is very necessary. So, for example, nurses, teachers, taxi drivers, exotic dancers, even police. There is a skill set that is developed over time in these occupations in which there can be a very nuanced and sophisticated, I'm going to use the word manipulation of the affective space in order to control bodies in agency. And through performing and through various occupations that I've had in which these effective labours, different forms of effective labour, have had to be learnt and developed as skills. That's how it comes to be transferred into my art practice. Yeah. But I can't tell you how to do it. You have to learn by doing.
Yeah.
That's the trick.
And it would be interesting to somehow find out where your approach and your approach, where they are limited by the not only present limitations of VR, but also the future limitations, so that you, in effect, will never touch the skin of a person you meet in VR. You will not touch it.
But my question to that question is, why do we need to?
Yeah, that is... People are thinking about that a lot and investing lots of money into the simulation of a skin touch. So the old, I don't know, probably driven by weird sexual needs, that someday there will be body-to-body contact via electricity possible. But yeah.
I'm just wondering whether, isn't on some level, trusting sort of in the powers of the imagination that then can actually work through some of these things and maybe can get to a sort of sphere of touching that otherwise, so you have, what you're doing obviously with VR is you're really giving one of your sensory perceptions, sight, a really intense experience. And I think you can harness that and work with that if you're trying to also sort of think of the other senses and think specifically about listening and sound, then you can create a sense of touching through that as one level. That would be a much easier thing to do. So especially if you work with binaural sound, and there have been a lot of really interesting performance examples of binaural sound experiments where you do have the sense, if somebody is then breathing into your ear, you do have the sense of actually a shiver running down your spine. So you don't have to have the person there. You just have to sort of fake that well in that sort of sense. And since you're already so intensely immersed in one way, I think you can support that with sort of other gestures. And the other thing, I was just in Bristol 2 days ago, I think, and there was a sort of multi-person VR space where it was really interesting to be in the space with like 3 or 4 other people, and you would sort of play around with throwing things towards each other. And the only thing that was really kind of weird and strange was that when these sort of kind of balls or objects were coming towards you, they wouldn't stop at you, obviously, they would just go right through you, and you'd be like, okay, there needs to be just some tiny little thing. It could just be even a sound, or it could be just the sense of the thing sort of like moving backwards without it having touched you. It would give you the intense kind of feeling of actually being touched. So I think there are really interesting ways around it that are maybe much more magical than creating this sort of full bodysuit experience.
Yeah, so there are quite a few theater groups working on that field, combining, and in our email preparation I mentioned Macropole and Bombina Bombast as 2 examples. One, for those who don't know their work, called the shared individual. They've got a full audience, all having headgears on, and they see all the place they're actually in, and they see the performer who's actually on stage, and then they switch into her perspective and spread out their hands in front of them, and then the person on stage is touched. It's physically touched, and the audience feels it through the jump into the perspective of a protagonist. That is a very interesting theater or theater magic moment that you obviously will come up in your future endeavors in VR as well, or maybe not. But that's something that obviously works. How does that fit into your line of questioning, Gerko?
Yeah, I think we have, if we look at, even if we look at the word touch, we have like these two dimensions, or these two usages of the word, where on the one hand we have like the physical haptical touch, and then we have a whole discourse in the perception of art of being touched, and there's no like actual touch happening, or no like haptic touch happening, and I think this is precisely what Ramona was referring to, like to have this being affected by and to have a bodily sensation that you see, and I think these being touched is also very much connected to, if we look at I don't know if you look at empathy or so, and the example that always comes up is the rope dancer, and you really fear the fear of height, and even though you're sitting on your chair, and so I think we don't, as you both said, we don't need the actual physical touch happening to have similar sensations, and then of course we have to look at touch as really like this complex knot of affects and sensations, rather than just the stimulation of the skin. So I would say that like to stimulate the skin with an electronic device is probably the most boring way to think about touch in technical terms, and you can do it in much like more complex ways without using this technology.
Could you elaborate on the point of empathy, how empathy is connected to feeling a touch without being physically touched?
I think it's so in empathy, you the discussion is a lot about that you feel something that you see somebody else is feeling. So that, like, the most common examples, like somebody is sad and you get sad, or somebody's angry, and in an empathetic involvement you also get angry. But of course you have in arts, you have, like, you watch a movie and you see somebody is mourning or so, and you get a, like, not exactly the same, but more a similar state of sensational affective state, and of course you can then link it very much to the perception of movement, and to when you watch dance, a lot of the pleasure in watching dance is that you see people performing movements that and you in a way feel it in your body without performing them yourself, without performing these movements yourself, and of course also the risk, as I said, with the rope dancer, the risks that are connected to these movements, and so there is a certain kind of like being touched with in the sensorial realm of vision or acoustics, but without the direct touch between stage and audience, or artwork and audience.
Yeah, and I think also the question in terms of empathy is obviously one of proximity, right? I mean, like, that's what VR can really render. It can render things really, really close to you, and that's why I think mean, there's all this stuff about how VR is sort of an empathy machine, actually, and that it can obviously also be used for political purposes quite well. And there are these things like there is a VR channel for the UN that is trying to give you a sort of refugee experience, and the fact that, as in the shared individual, that you supposedly really be able to switch out of your body and out of your individual consciousness into the one of another. That's obviously one of the sort of, I don't know, that's one of those dreams that everybody has had at some point or another. Like, what would it be like to look at myself from outside of my body? And that's what the shared individual can render. You look at yourself as the audience, although you are still there. So that is a very strange sort of feedback. And I think with dance, the other thing that's obviously really exciting about that and how to combine the two is that dance obviously really works with talking you through and harnessing sort of real somatic experiences. So I was wondering actually what it would be like if you, if in VR you didn't just reference the world that you are moving into, but you also reference back somehow to your body and you talk people through their physical experience that's still outside so you have this sort of world that you're in. But at the same time, this was what our dancers were trying to do, because they had to sort of try and check back in with their body that was still outside of the visual sphere that they were in, right? Because they still had to move outside of VR in one way or another. And I mean, in effect, they were dancing blind when they were dancing there. And so, in a way, you have to sort of try and relate back to other body parts in ways that you usually wouldn't. So there might be really interesting ways of having a back and forth between having a really interesting other sort of visual experience and also getting sort of little ideas or sort of pointers to sort of feedback into your legs or to your arms or something else, or like feel where you're sweating now or something like that, and having these sort of like very sort of minute detailed things of checking back in with your body, I guess, in a way.
Ramona, I'm interested in this project that you made, and in terms of it being presented, say it's being presented to a larger audience, what the audience sees. So they see everything we see on the screen now, so they're seeing the person with their body in VR, but also their VR experience on the screen. I think that's a thing I really enjoyed with this one experience that I had. I was with a friend who's also a dancer and a choreographer, and we were both remarking on how quickly we abandoned any knowledge of our physicality that we had understood, and we've trained somatically, and we abandoned it completely in order to understand the mechanics of this new world. But we were both very conscious somehow in this dual core kind of moment of the performativity of our body outside the VR experience. And I think that for me is the most interesting setup in terms of a theatrical or an art context, is seeing this kind of hauntological experience, like this agency of the virtual, as Mark Fisher says, like the being at the cusp of two spaces, and watching someone who is so skilled bodily completely abandon their body knowledge. Because this thing with dance, and why dance is so interesting to experience live and not so interesting to experience on video, is because the empathy also happens because you are witnessing these bodies labor. There's no better choreography than one in which people are really working. I also just wanted to comment on this empathy, this idea of an empathy training through VR, and that terrifies me. I think it's just... on the one hand, there's this amazing project and this interesting setup and being able to sit at the cusp, and then at the other end, there's this idea that, the death of empathy is because of the systematic destruction of imagination. So, I just wanted to throw that in.
But couldn't it also be? So I was wondering. That was also one idea that came up in the talks with Carl Ginnet. Would it be? Could there be like a switch? So when you meet a person in VR, in something like VR chat, you can't be sure that this person, even if or in a real person avatar, you will never know if it's a real person. So normally people go into fairy and or super heroes and or famous computer game characters and so on. When they choose an avatar for a VR chat, but some of them use photos of themselves to render their avatar, so that somehow represents their body or their physique, some not. Would there be something like a realness button that really proves, like encrypted proofs that this person's image is the real image? Would that be something in VR that would enable more empathy? So, like, I know that just from friends, but in Tinder you've got this switch in a relationship when you go to a WhatsApp or where your real phone number is available, and you leave the one digital bubble for the next one. But there's kind of it's an intimate move. Would something like I really look like this in VR be an intimate trigger or an empathy trigger?
For me personally, like if we're going to talk about the VR space as some kind of potential social space where we take it to another digital space. I mean, it's about fantasy and play. I'm not interested. For me personally, I'd be far more interested in the way someone has constructed their avatar, if is that what we call it? I felt like I just sounded really 90s when I said that. Yeah, I'm much more interested in people's literacy within the visual field than having some sort of authenticity moment. But that's also because I make theatre and I'm not interested in authenticity. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would second that and say that it's really like coming from theatre or film or so. We see a lot of like empathy, moments of empathy without any realness factor. Like I think cinema is probably the best example for it. And in the whole discussion about empathy, there was at the beginning of the century the whole discussion about is there the possibility of empathy with abstract forms. So is there do we even need a human body to feel empathy? And I think a lot of what we described with like feeling the movement a dancer's performing, it doesn't really matter if it's a human dancer, if you maybe see just some movements. And I think there's VR as a field where you can really in a very interesting way experiment with that, and because you're not bound anymore to the human body, you can much more easily animate non-human bodies than you can do on a real-life stage, where, of course, you can do it, but it takes much more effort.
I was thinking this when I was watching the VR chat videos that you shared, and then I went into this YouTube wormhole watching VR chat videos for a really long time. And I was kind of exactly in this new materialist kind of interest. You know, I think I'd be a table or a mountain. You know what I mean? Like, you're not limited to the human form. And so perhaps that also opens out this VR space as a really interesting space for practical experimentation and play with questions of ethics that are really important, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I was just kind of thinking back on when I was in that multi-VR space. We were only represented by like a box. I was a pink box, there was a green box and a blue box. And I thought, whew, okay, this is actually like super liberating not to have to think about your body or different parts of it and to be reduced that much to like just that little box. And I was like, whoa, I can play around. This is great. And I think I'm kind of wondering whether it's not thinking through reduction as a way to actually kind of create a much more intense and interesting experience in VR. Like not to try to make a forest where you feel like every leaf looks real, right? But rather to kind of just have one sensation maybe that you're really after. Like we did a symposium as part of this, and there was a VR shaman, and she was really into lucid dreams, and she really wanted to create the idea of floating. Floating was her thing. That's what she wanted to do. So I'm wondering whether if you're just sort of channeling all of the sort of info that you put into the VR into that sort of floating experience, whether that's not a much more interesting experience to be had than to just sort of sit in a forest that's totally real or seems to be totally real, and where you can sort of walk around and that's it, right? So because really what you want is you want a sort of shift in perception, whatever you do, whether it's in theatre or whether it's in VR. You somehow want to be surprised. That's what Brecht wanted, that's what we all still want somehow. And you want that, oh my God, is that really true? And so I'm kind of wondering, how do you get to these things? And I think it's really becoming quite adept and literate at how the medium works. And I think we really I mean, certainly I have very basic only ideas of it, and I think in general, aesthetically, VR is really at the whatever, at like the toddler stage, if that, right? So in many ways, we still have to make up the aesthetic vocabulary to make this work and to make this interesting. Because I was actually in preparation for this, I was looking through different sort of video game things, and everybody was talking about Journey, this video game that actually doesn't work at all with language, but has these you're a sort of cloaked person that goes through a desert, and you're trying to go all the way up to a mountain, and in the end, the whole thing is sort of a metaphor of what life is all about, sort of climbing to that mountain, and when you get to the mountain, you die. But in the end, you go to heaven, and it's kind of nice. So I mean, it was kind of an interesting, cool experience, but it was actually working. It was not working with language. It wasn't really verbalizing any storyline. It wasn't kind of trying to get you to do loads of different things. It was quite simple, and the simplicity of that, I think, was the thing that made it really quite captivating, and also allowed for loads and loads of people to be playing this. And so I'm wondering, isn't that what we kind of need to figure out? What are actually the aesthetic tools in VR, and how are they different? And how do we actually have to learn again to have a body when we're in there? Because you really do have to learn that again.
I think that I want to go to back to one thing you said that might be an interesting correlation, because you described a group experience, or at least a small group experience. Also, what Macropole and Bombina Bombasta are doing successfully is a group experience. Theater is or dance is a group experience. Does it need that moment to lose at least a little bit of yourself in the group setting to enable empathy and touch without physical skin touch, so that you go to a big scale concert to immerse yourself in the crowd and then get really touched? Is that something that could be simulated in VR to enable touching? Like, for example, you choose an abstract uniform form that strips your body very metaphorically aside. Could that be something?
I don't know. Maybe.
Is that the way to intimacy in VR?
Maybe that is. I mean, I'm kind of. I mean, definitely. I think the whole question of how to become social in VR and not be totally isolated, sort of sitting in the corner with your glasses and everything else has sort of gone away. I think that's very important, and I think people who are in the field, like, that's what Apple's sort of sticking point is, right? AR is much more interesting than VR because it allows you to kind of have that sociability much more easily. So how can you create that sort of social dimension? And I think that is certainly super interesting. And then in the context that I was in, I mean, you obviously have to have a very, very powerful computer in order to create that sort of space where you're all in at the same time. And what they are now able to do is they can also have people come in remotely, so that all of them are there, whether you're all in the same room originally or whether somebody comes in from Beijing, China, and you all sort of sit there. And in this case, this is because it's in a research setting, which actually it's geeky scientists showing each other their sort of molecules and what the molecules they've created, which I think is fascinating. And it apparently works much better to look at them in VR than in the real world, because of the way you can sort of enlarge them and you can touch them and you can throw them around and stuff like that. So maybe, I mean, I definitely think in general figuring out how to connect with others within that VR space, I think that's definitely one of the big challenges and is the thing that needs to be addressed. And I think, I guess you got to go through the first thing. It's like you're there and you're just first of all experiencing for yourself. But what does it mean if you now add all four of us and we'll sit there and how does that change us, I guess, in a way?
And we're not only four of us, but also an audience. You can prepare already your questions, because we will go soon into a Q&A if you want to, and if we are happy to have your questions. But I just wanted to challenge your authenticity, because if I remember correctly, your vertigo performance could end up for some visitors. So you put them up onto a bell tower and then you rang the bell. Did I research that correctly?
Oh yeah.
And I think
that happened.
Then under certain circumstances you ended up in a bed and they sang you a lullaby.
That's correct.
It's an incredible intimate very aesthetically designed performance, but maybe you can, because that sounds so intimate and so unescapably authentic.
Well, it was definitely real.
Yeah.
But I was a persona at the time, and the entire. So in this performance, an appointment with Jay Dark, a single audience member at a time spends an hour or 50 minutes with me, doing various things, culminating in us being at the top of a clock tower of a town hall, doing, as you said, ringing the bell, lying down, singing a song. But on the journey there, the entire thing was very much about these different stations in which I was shape-shifting, and the audience member or the participant or the other was invited to experiment with shape-shifting in terms of their own subjectivity and their own subjectivity, sense of self, multiplicity. So I mean, this question of authenticity comes up, and the whole point of the show is that there is no singularity, like this idea of this is me, this is myself, this is who I am. But yes, it was definitely real. That it was very sweet, and we sang a song at the end.
Sounds great. I want to be part of it.
You would love it.
So the way to the situation and the shape-shifting is an important factor for experiencing then some unauthentic intimacy in that situation.
No, I don't think it's... I avoid this term authentic altogether.
Okay. Yeah.
It's
Then,
real.
Yeah. A real experience in VR would be a really great thing. So maybe that might be something to go into detail as well, to think about how do you meet somebody in VR through certain stages of shifting, or if shape or whatever, or losing your individual appearance more and more, or getting a new one, or diving in deeper layers and diving in, and then laying the ground out for a real touch without a physical feedback.
I think that as Ramona was describing these scientists and have their big models of their molecules, I mean, that's such a seductive idea for me, the idea that multiple people can converge in a space, and the touch is happening through, say, for example, the thing that they are modeling together, in which everything we understand about form is erased and we can begin again. I mean, of course, there are going to be parameters for now, but and so then you can get into really interesting kind of, again, praxis outside of language, practical convergence, which is extremely intimate because people in acts of creation and experimentation are at their most vulnerable.
I agree. I was just wondering, actually, intimacy, right? I have like a really weird video on like intimacy, if you want. Has anybody heard of ASMR? Right, so this is like this big thing, right? And I think that's a really interesting way of how you fake touch again, right? It's something where you, so the videos are these usually sort of women that speak in very quiet, beautiful voices to people, and they give them a sense of extreme relaxation and an actual tingling across the spine because you're suddenly in a sort of oral world that is so pared down again and reduced that that you're suddenly really intensively experiencing these sounds that otherwise would just be sort of background or would be sort of blending into stuff. And so, I mean, they are totally weird, I think, and I certainly did not have a tingly feeling experience when I watched them, but I thought it's very interesting, and this was really using YouTube in its own way and in a way that really worked, right? Because it really was using it within its own context and was thinking, well, what do people do? They sometimes, when they want to chill, they just watch a YouTube video, and they were giving them this intense feeling of being able to sort of step out of their own sort of setting and experience it. So I think there's another version of sort of creating intimacy without being authentic about it at all. I think, I guess, well, I'm not sure, but definitely being in a very strange realm there.
Thank you very much up until that point. And now we open up for a Q&A. If there are any questions, Tim is over there. He might have a mic. No. Yeah, okay, cool. Are there already any questions for that panel? Yeah. Them. Yeah. can have mine.
Hi. Yeah, it's not working, I think.
No, it's working.
It's working.
No, it's fine. It works.
Does it work? Ah, okay. Headphones. Ah, yeah, I didn't know that it's the headphones, of course. So, yeah, I'm curious if you know anything about ideas, what happens to the body in general. Of course, the human being can be confronted with many suggestions, and but I still ask myself, what happens to the entire body? Will it be a suit? Will humans be in a water tank or so? I mean, in the future, people have to come up with stuff, what to do with the body if the human being wants to immerse completely into VR. So what's new about that?
I mean, the only thing that comes to my mind is like I saw some pictures of an VR arcade, an arcade space in New York that's right next to the Empire State Building, and there you really are sort of hooked up and you're sort of held because you're so intensively acting in that, or moving around, that you sort of somehow need to be constricted in order not to fall over. So I'm wondering whether you're just sort of, maybe you just lie down in a tank. I like that idea. Actually, especially in a water tank, because then the whole idea of being immersed sort of physically and slowly becoming some sort of shape-shifting fish, and at the same time being immersed kind of conceptually. I love the water tank idea. But yeah, so the only other thing I can think of is these kind of weird arcades where you sort of like tied into something.
Maybe I can. Okay. So these suits are incredibly complicated, highly resource needing, and not very effective in my experience. So, and also you have to get naked, and if you rent them, so you're in a VR arcade and you get like a very complicated diving suit on. That's not that doesn't enable me to immerse myself into anything except for shame, and as a VR user, I have two different forms. The one that fits to what the panel said, in a group where I experience something challenging with others. And so I would opt for the VR arcade, but in a non-naked sense. And the other thing is when I use it at home, I'm extremely sensible to lock the door to the room so that no child or no cat is entering the room and jumps onto me while I'm wearing that. And I just need the safest and the most comfortable place for me to relax and really fall into it. And that can be lying down, which is sometimes complicated depending on the headset, or sitting in a comfortable chair. And that's me. And I like being. I like being myself to get them, but that will probably change with our ways into getting there. And I can, but to let loose, it's safe, warm, and alone, I guess.
I'm sorry, I'm really stuck on this idea now of the getting in the swimming pool and this, just this idea of being able to like slide into this kind of like sensory jelly kind of situation. It's amazing. That's all.
Yeah, that might also be a big point that professionals will, in a very caring way, will immerse you into the place where you can then really immerse.
It's very wormhole, isn't it?
Yeah. Next question. Yeah. Tim is coming with a mic.
I just wanted to say that the immersive experience was done a few months ago at VR Days Europe in Amsterdam. There was a tank. It was a container that was filled with water, and one side was glass. And the experience was swimming with dolphins, and you would be there was a changing room where you could have your own bathing suit, and then you would dive into the tank, and people could see you swimming in the tank by yourself, but you were with the dolphins and with a waterproof headset on, and that was a remarkable experience. Just to share.
How long did it take?
The film itself, I think, was about 5-6 minutes. And it was just basically an experiential thing of being with the dolphins and the dolphins coming up to you. But the nice thing was the immersive quality of the experience was incredible because you were in the water as well. So there was a perfect duplication, and the movement. It felt just natural. It was a wonderful experience.
But you couldn't touch a dolphin, so there was not a physical prop that represented. Okay.
No, it was just yourself in your bathing suit with like a diving mask on, and the diving mask was a headset.
Yeah, thank you.
But thank you for that. That's really exciting because I think that's precisely what I mean, that you somehow have to, you're activating your body sensation at the same time in a sort of different yet supportive way, I think. And I think those kinds of things would be super, super interesting. And I think they can work commercially really well as well, not just in a sort of like weird theatrical experimental context, which I totally out myself being in, right? And so, but I think thank you for that. That's really great.
I have pictures.
And I also think that the question with the body is because the body is really like there are so many physical restrictions in real life. So the question is, if we experiment with VR, do we want to like duplicate the restrictions we have in real life to have a feeling as if we were in real life, or do we want to use the potential to create another body? So the question would be then like where to go with the body is really the question of do we want to try to copy reality or to really create new bodies and use the potential to create new bodies, which I would say is much more interesting than to in a always much more sophisticated way and developing way try to copy reality.
Also because there are a lot of people who are not able-bodied, right? And so there are extremely limited bodies that, it should be democratic.
And bodies get older, and also when you go into the back markets of VR chat, I mentioned that yesterday in another round, there are now people offering their services on Fiverr or on different Reddits that they rebuild your avatar after your photos you send them, so you can, or people somehow chose also pictures of deceased or people who they loved to recreate them and then give them another person in VR chat, so they come in, ask if they can swap avatars so that their opposite is the emulation of a deceased loved one, or maybe somebody they fell in love long time ago, and the potential of that to get really like this Black Mirror San Fernando, where they where they're in the senior citizen home, that potential is enormous. And since Google probably knows who I ever Googled since 1997, they've got a pretty good picture of what characters might be very interesting for me as a senile paraplegic. Any more questions?
I was actually wondering whether anybody had what anybody else's most intense VR experience has been recently, aside from the dolphins, which I think wins first place anyway. But what was it? What kind of experience was it that was most transformative for you?
Last year I've been to the World Hosting Days in Europa Park in Rust. It's a fun park that opens a week after this event, and they had a very simple roller coaster. It was not even a roller coaster. It was just like a round track for children. It was not very spectacular, going up and down. But some people programmed something really nice for VR goggles, and you would find yourself inside of a huge mountain, and where everything was full of crystals and funny creatures, and there they used the physical effect of going up and down to actually prolong it for loops, and you would have completely different experiences. Like you were like going like into an 8 and you would fall and you fell, then the railway broke and you fell down and a dragon saved you and the dragon was flying away with you, and it all happened on this very simple track. So you can suggest many things. So that's amazing about the human brain. Wow.
Hi, I think it was two experiences, and both of them has to do with seeing yourself in the experience. The one was when you were sitting in a room and you got the glasses and you see yourself in front of you. And the really nice point of that is that when you try to touch yourself, you feel suddenly you feel that someone is touching you. You feel that you are touching yourself because someone is in front of you sitting, mimicking your movement. So it was the first time you tried to touch yourself, like, yeah, I'm going to be in the virtual world, and you feel something. You're like, oh, that's me. It was very, very nice. And the other one was also a project that you see yourself in the room, like with the clothes you have and so on, because it's mixed with 3D technology, so that's very nice. And you actually are in the same room, like out-of-body experience, and trying to figure out why are you there and so on. So that's very nice when you're this kind of out-of-body experience, but you don't know if you are there or there. That's very nice.
Thank you for sharing.
One of the strongest experiences for me was the machine to be another. Particularly when you experience it, it's an experience you have two people, and particularly when you experience it with a person of the opposite sex than yours, and that was probably the strongest one. And yesterday I saw a pilot for an experience where I was a child, maybe 5-6 years old, and everything was to scale to my height. And it's a very, very simple and very basic experience, but it was incredibly moving to see the adults much bigger than me, to see the furniture so inaccessible, and everything from that point of view. Very, very basic and simple, but very effective.
Thank you very much. We're now at the end of our time. I'd like to wrap it up. And thank you very much for being with us for 60 minutes, which is... Sorry. Do you still hear me? Yeah, cool. Okay. So, thank you very much for the panelists, Melanie, Jame Wolf, Ramona Mosse, and Gerko Egert. They're still available for Q&A here, and you're welcome to ask them questions. And I think we laid good ground for our endeavors in the next year. And also this afternoon at 4:15, Senator for Culture in Europe, Dr. Klaus Lederer, will announce the schedule to have a fully funded innovation fund in Berlin that will fund hopefully all our endeavors and those experiences we will like to experience, and yours as well. And hope to see you on the next panel or on the next stage or next year. Thank you very much. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Ashtin, for hosting us.